Good afternoon, everyone, as it just hits noon here in Baltimore. Let me welcome everyone to the Berman Institute biweekly seminar. I'm Jeff Kahn, for those of you who I don't know, and the director of the Berman Institute, and I'm joined today from my office here in Deering Hall. I'm going to turn over the introduction of today's speaker to my colleague Joe Ali in just a moment, but I wanted to just say a few things by way of welcome and introduction. One is, of course, today is Indigenous Peoples Day, for the first time a federal holiday, as well as being shared with Columbus Day. So we should acknowledge the original people of the land on which we work and live. The second thing I'd like to say before turning it over to Joe is that the biweekly seminars almost always are an invitation to an outside speaker. Periodically, we have somebody from within the Johns Hopkins community if a topic is of particular importance, and only rarely do we have one of our own colleagues as a speaker, but that is a treat we're going to enjoy today because in part, this is a session to congratulate our colleague Len Rubenstein on his recent publication of a new book called Perilous Medicine, which we will hear about today. So congrats to Len on the publication. The reviews so far I have seen have been very positive, so we congratulate you on that as well, and welcome you to be a seminar speaker for us today. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Joe Ali, who will do the formal introduction of Len and Len's talk and will be moderator for today's session. So today, thanks, Joe, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Jeff. And thank you, Len, for joining us for today's seminar. As Jeff mentioned, the seminar will be an opportunity for us to hear directly from Len about his recent book publication titled, as Jeff mentioned, Perilous Medicine, The Struggle to Protect Healthcare from the Violence of War. Len is a colleague and also, like myself, a lawyer whose work focuses on health and human rights, especially the protection of health in armed conflict and the roles of health professionals in human rights. So those who know Len well knows he's been doing work on that in that area for many, many years. He serves as a core member of the Berman Institute of Bioethics, but has joint appointments in the Bloomberg School of Public Health, where he has directed the program in human rights, health, and conflict at the Center for Public Health and Human Rights for many years. He's also a core faculty member of the Center for Humanitarian Health at the School of Public Health. Prior to coming to Johns Hopkins, Len served as executive director and then president of Physicians for Human Rights, and as Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace. He was also executive director of the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. So we're really delighted that Len agreed to come talk with us today about his new book, which, as Jeff mentioned, has been getting rave reviews. There was a recent piece, for those who are interested in the BMJ, about his book, a review, which was extremely supportive and positive. And I'll just read one sentence here from that review, which I think speaks to the contribution. So as the author wrote, it's viewed as a major new book on healthcare in armed conflict, which the author notes is destined to become a landmark in its field. So I think we'll see, Len, how it plays out down the road, but I'm sure it will indeed be critical to catalyzing work on this issue, which is so critical, important to the safety of healthcare workers around the world and to upholding human rights. So thank you, Len, again for joining us, and we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Joe and Jeff, for those generous introductions. And it really is a privilege to be speaking to my colleagues here at the Berman Institute, as well as to the larger audience. And I'd like to start with the odd title of the talk about paradoxical fragility. It's paradoxical because the norm of protection healthcare in conflict is arguably the oldest human rights treaty in the world, 150 years old. And that treaty had one focus only, the protection of healthcare, nothing else. And yet we see the problem of violence against healthcare not only continues, but it has not been on the global health agenda, the academic agenda, really anyone's agenda until the last decade. I recently did a systematic review of journal articles over the last 40 years on this question, and there were 45 articles. So we have no attention, in fact, to this issue. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'll give you a little background because the subject is unfamiliar to most people. Then I'll talk about the norms of protection and competing norms, and then how these norms play out in a logic of violence against healthcare, and then talk a little bit about restoration and adherence to norms. So I'll talk first to give you a little background. I'll just start with my own first exposure to this problem. I went to Bosnia right after the war in 1996, actually to release a report that Physicians for Human Rights had written. My predecessor as director had written it. And one of the stories concerned the pediatrician in the left-hand picture, Dr. Emma Zeshevich, who was a pediatrician in the Pediatric and Gynecological Hospital. And she was given almost no warning that her hospital was about to be shelled. And she had killed babies in incubators in the neonatal unit. And they quickly got the babies out, although she could not believe her hospital would be shelled. They did get out, went to a hospital next door, and sure enough, the hospital was shelled, the unit was destroyed, as was the hospital next door. They were in the basement and survived, most of them, but the electricity and water was knocked out. It was very cold, and 9 of the babies did not survive the night. They then moved to Kosovo Hospital, which you see in the right-hand picture, which you see was also shelled. And when I was there, it was covered by plastic sheeting, the UNHCR plastic covering. Some of you have seen those. And it turned out, after this first exposure, I did work in a lot of other places, in Chechnya, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Afghanistan, and other places, and was not only appalled by what I saw, but puzzled why this had not gotten on the international agenda. So, in fact, it had a long history. On the top left, you see a picture from the bombings by Mussolini in the Ethiopian War. And what's really important is that Red Cross, the hospitals were marked by huge Red Crosses, which Mussolini's nascent Air Force used as targets. And on the right, you see Dresden. Of course, there was strategic bombing in World War II, and of course, incendiary bombing and the atomic bomb in Japan. And then in Korea, the bottom, few people know that there was strategic napalm-based bombing against 18 cities in North Korea that leveled about 1,000 hospitals. And in Vietnam, we all know about the use of napalm and defoliants. And you can see this story from the New York Times about the bombing of the Bach Mai Hospital in Hanoi during the so-called Christmas bombings. So we have a bad history, and bringing you up to date, these are the countries in which violence against healthcare has taken place. This is from 2019. It was started by it was reported by the Safeguarding Health and Conflict Coalition, which is a group I started about 10 years ago, consisting of about 40 NGOs, humanitarian organizations, and academic centers. We also did a report last year on the period 2016 when a Security Council resolution was adopted to 2020, and you can see more than 4,000 attacks. And while this is not an epidemiological statement, if you look at the numbers and you do a little division, that amounts to an attack on a hospital that damaged or destroyed it every 2 days, and a health worker killed every 3 days. And that's excluding the injuries and kidnapping. So this is a kind of a devastating problem. And I don't have time to talk about the impacts, but we know they have phenomenal impacts. Take 3 recent and ongoing conflicts. In particular, in Syria, there have been 600 shelling, bombing, and missile attacks on hospitals. 70% of the pre-war medical staff has fled, 900 health workers killed. And you can see that in Yemen and Libya, which depended enormously on foreign health workers, they also left. And in both cases, the health system has collapsed. And without dwelling on this too much, I just want to point out a couple of things. The International Polio Eradication Initiative had the goal of eradicating polio by the year 2000, just as smallpox has been eradicated. But here we are in 2021, polio remains endemic in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and it does so because the extensive violence against vaccinators in those countries, as well as Nigeria, Somalia, and elsewhere. It's a case where we would have had an eradication of a terrible disease, but for the violence. And here is a little graph on cholera, which shows some of the countries like Haiti and other places which have had major cholera outbreaks. But in Yemen, the number is off the charts, literally 2 million cases. And that was a product of the bombing of the health infrastructure in Yemen at the same time as the health system had collapsed. So there's one other dimension that is often overlooked. Health workers in these situations are always called heroes, courageous, self-sacrificing. But in fact, they suffer from two major problems, impacts beyond the fear of being hit in an attack. One is enormous moral distress. My interviews with Syrian health workers talked about the guilt they feel for not being able to do their jobs, especially when they had to turn down parents who were desperate to have their children saved, but they didn't have the resources or the generators to save them. Second, they feel completely abandoned. They feel like there is no solidarity with them. We can compare this actually to the Nobel Peace Prize last week. It's so common for journalists at risk to be supported by their colleagues and by the world at large and recognized, but not so for health workers who are on the front lines. So let me turn to the norms. What you see on the right is a picture of the Battle of Solferino, was northern Italy in 1859. And a humanitarian Swiss gentleman, you see in the picture, named Henri Dunant, happened upon this as he was looking for a business deal. And you can see there are wounded and dying people on the battlefield. And you can also see that they're unattended. And they were unattended because at the time, there was no protection for any people seeking to care for them when injured. And if you went on the field of battle, you could be shot. In fact, some health workers were arrested when they tried at that battle. And he wrote this book, A Memory of Solferino, after his experience. And the book was as popular in Europe as Uncle Tom's Cabin was in the United States, and had an enormous impact and led to a movement which went very quickly to establish humanitarian volunteer organizations and protections for those who cared for the wounded and sick, the wounded especially. And it was all based on the principle of humanity, which he expressed as to prevent or at least alleviate the horrors of war, that it was based on the importance of human rights, humane desire to lighten a little the torments of these poor wretches, more or less equivalent to principles we think of as impartiality and justice in bioethics. In the modern Geneva Conventions, this was expressed by Jean Pictet, who wrote the commentaries to 1949 conventions, as assisting human beings plunged into suffering, among whom all distinctions have been wiped out. And it was basically a deontological approach. It wasn't consequentialist. It wasn't full of any exceptions or conditions, unless health facilities were being misused for some reason. And that became the basis for Geneva Conventions. And here is the whole history of the Geneva Conventions in a single slide. There was the 1864 convention that you can see men only gathering to adopt in 1864. It was modernized after the Second World War to protect civilians, not just wounded soldiers in civilian hospitals, and it also required humane treatment in internal wars. Then in 1977, significantly right after the Vietnam War, and in part because of the global movement of hostility to the tactics in that war, two principles were adopted and recorded in the treaty. One, distinguishing between military and civilian objects in targeting. You must distinguish them. And the principle of proportionality, which is a difficult one to apply, but basically prevents disproportionate use of force and says collateral damage is not necessarily okay if it's not proportional. It applies even more broadly to civil wars. And interestingly, for the first time in international law, it specifically said that there can't be punishment of healthcare providers for acts required by medical ethics. And it got in there because people were being prosecuted, medics, doctors, nurses were being prosecuted for treating enemies during the war. It didn't define medical ethics, but I think that there were two principles that are overwhelmingly important to war. One is impartiality, and the other is justice, that people should be treated based on their needs, not on who they are. And this came up actually here in the US at the Boston Marathon bombing, when one of the brothers was severely injured by the police when he was captured. And he was brought to a hospital in Boston. The media were all over this, and Dr. Stephen Odom treated him, saved his life. And they said, "Why are you treating this terrorist?" And this is what he said: "What would the alternative be? People do terrible stuff and get care. It's just what we do." And that idea that it's just what we do has broad support within the medical and bioethics community. There was a symposium in 2009 in the American Journal of Bioethics on medical care for terrorists. And it was mostly Israeli, as well as other bioethicists and clinicians who looked at a case of a Palestinian terrorist who was captured and brought to a hospital. And about the 10 responses, only one said there was any limitation to treat, and that was only in the case of paying for long-term treatment. But there was unanimity on an obligation to treat. So there's a confluence between for international law, a duty of impartiality in treatment by combatants, and medical ethics. And yet, at the very same time, Dunant was writing the convention. A man named Francis Lieber, who was a leading intellectual of his time in the United States. He was friends with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was engaged in prison reform with Alexis de Tocqueville. He was friends with Justice Joseph Story, and he became a theorist of morality in war. And he agreed with Dunant that the law of war should have limitations and restrictions based on certain principles, as he called justice, honor, and faith. And he was asked in 1863 to write a code for the Union Army in the Civil War. It's still called the Lieber Code. Abraham Lincoln signed the code, and you can see it on the top, but he had a different view. He said that there should be protections. There should not be gratuitous cruelty in war. That is, you shouldn't torture prisoners for no good reason except that you hate them. There shouldn't be any kind of gratuitous harm to civilians, but you could engage in otherwise terrible acts against anyone, armed or unarmed, including sieges and starvation, toward the speedier subjugation of the enemy. He believed that a just war warranted departure from the kind of principles that Dunant was advocating, even though the two did not correspond or have much to do with each other, except that Lieber wanted to attend the meeting where the convention was adopted, but Lincoln wouldn't send him because the war was still going on. But he believed that a just war warranted departure from those kinds of principles in order to end it quickly. As a result, his code says that hospitals are protected only as much as the contingencies and necessities of the fight will permit. And we saw that. We all know the story of General Sherman in his Battle of Atlanta. The mayor asked him to spare pregnant women and children from the suffering. And this was Sherman's response: if we must be enemies, let us be men, fight it out as we're supposed to do, and not deal in such hypocritical appeals to God and humanity. And it's generally believed that Sherman did not breach the Lieber Code. Now, Lieber lost the intellectual argument and he lost the legal argument. The Geneva Conventions utterly reject that view, but it survives. And my book is about how that view has survived. Occasionally, though rarely, it's articulated. Usually it's subterranean, as I'll explain when I talk about the nature of the violence. But here is a statement from a speech, a major speech by the General Counsel of the Department of Defense just in 2019, which justified the use of explosive indiscriminate weapons in an urban area to prevent ISIS or terrorist groups from seizing control of an urban area and using it as part of their tactical defense. It's a quintessential example of Lieberesque logic, that it's okay to cause indiscriminate and terrible harm to civilians in the service of a military objective. He's not the only one, though. A brilliant professor at Yale, law professor and historian who has written a lot about the Lieber Code, agrees with this view. He criticizes Lieber's moral vision as that because just ends may be more salient measures of the morality of war than human suffering. And after all, the Civil War was about abolition of slavery. And to wit, you have to take that into account. And you can see too that he had an ends justifying the means view, that weighty ends justify grave means. He tried to put some limits on these, on that point of view, saying that if the means were terrible enough, you could consider the war not just. But the problem is you can still commit war crimes in an otherwise just war. And it's such an open-ended standard. It amounts, in my view, not to be a standard. There are my cards on the table. I'm a Dunantist. So how does that play out in violence? We've been talking about violence against healthcare for many years, but there's been little attention because there's so little research on what beliefs, values, rationalizations go to drive and rationalize these attacks. And I came up with 5 of them. I'll talk about 4 of them today just because I don't have time to talk about the political message at the bottom. That it's a strategy of war. I'll start with that. Then I'll talk a bit about tactical interference. Third is recklessness. And the last I'll talk about is denial of care to enemies. That my argument is that these accomplish military objectives. Everyone thinks their war is just, even if no other groups or their enemies don't. And that gives a reason, not talking about motive so much here, but a reason to attack healthcare. So the first is the most dramatic. It's Syria, where there's widespread agreement by every investigative group that has come along that Syria deliberately target hospitals and medical units to gain military advantage. And the UN Commission on Syria said it was to deprive anti-government armed groups of medical assistance. I think there were other reasons. They were trying to displace civilian populations. They were trying to demoralize those supporters from supporting opposition forces. And we have abundant evidence that this is the case, that even cockpit recordings show that these hospitals were targeted, many of them multiple times. And the pattern shows they were targeted mostly during a military offensive. A second is tactical advantage. This is most common among armed groups. That's a picture of the National Hospital in Raqqa, Syria. And you can see the top of the hospital is a very convenient place to put machine guns, which is exactly what ISIS did while the hospital is in use. We see this in all kinds of other circumstances. For example, to store weapons in facilities, to demand priority in care rather than usual triage rules, even to kidnap health workers to go bring them to places where their wounded are situated. So that's a tactic in the field. What I call recklessness and inconvenience is a product of the rules that you have to take precautions, the kind I mentioned that come out of the 1977 additional protocols to the conventions that said you must make proportional attacks and you must distinguish military and civilian objects. On the left is a hospital in Yemen, and where despite efforts by its arms suppliers, the United States and the British, to try to improve their targeting, they did not. And in fact, I think the US became complicit in the use of those weapons to commit war crimes because it continued to supply those weapons after it was obvious to the world that they weren't properly targeted. That's why I call that recklessness. They didn't want to bother taking the time, and it does take time. It takes effort to select proper targets, to make sure that pilots are briefed on no strike targets, objects, no strike objects. It takes a lot of work. They didn't do it. It's also inconvenient. On the right is a Palestinian ambulance destroyed by the Israeli Defense Forces. Over the course of the last 20 years, there have been innumerable incidents of Israeli attacks on ambulances. Interestingly, back in 2002, I was in the region during the Second Intifada, and at that time, I went because I led a delegation concerning the fact that 6 Palestinian medics had been killed in 3 weeks or 2 weeks. And we talked to Israeli defense officials and many, many other people, and it was clear that they believed something needed to be done. And they actually reformed the procedures. Despite their claims of bombs being carried in ambulances, there were ways to protect themselves against that by inspecting the ambulances. But what was happening is they would inspect and still fire. They didn't train the troops, they didn't have strict rules. And it was a successful reform. And they were proud of it. And military officials I've spoken to since have been proud of it. But over time, that commitment dissipated. And in the wars in Gaza, in the last 10 years, there were 4 of them, the pattern of shooting at Palestinian ambulances that were cleared continued. The fourth one is most relevant to clinicians, I think. That's a picture of Hassan Bayev, a Chechen surgeon. It's a kind of famous picture because he's amputating the leg of one of the leading Chechen rebel commanders, a man named Basayev. He was injured like many others during retreat from stepping on a landmine. And Dr. Bayev saved his life by amputating his leg. He worked overnight, did about 25, 30 operations, exhausted, ran out of supplies, but saved many lives. For his work, the Russians called him the bandit doctor and targeted him. Yet at the same time, he was threatened with death by Chechen forces for treating Russians. Happily, he managed to escape and come to the United States, where he was granted asylum. But we see this idea that you should deny care to your enemies to keep them from the fight in so many different ways and in so many different circumstances. On the left is a community in Myanmar from research we did 10 years ago, but it's also happening today. And what we call backpack, what they call themselves backpack health workers who go through the forest to provide basic primary care and public health information distribution. But because they're providing care to these displaced populations, the Burmese armies deems the people they're treating and the health workers themselves to be enemies. Many have been killed as a result. And today, there are 300 arrest warrants out for Burmese health workers because of their willingness to oppose the regime. On the top is a picture from Afghanistan where, and this is not the Taliban, this is a picture from special forces of the Afghanistan then government, supported by the CIA, that violently broke into homes and other institutions to try to secure the arrest or killing of Taliban or other fighters. They did the same at hospitals and violently entered, on many occasions, they violently entered and killed staff in the process. And on the bottom is my friend and colleague, Mohammed Darwish. You see that Johns Hopkins in the background. He is a Syrian physician. He managed to get out some years ago, came here to Hopkins, got an MPH. He too was arrested back in 2011 when the demonstrations began, and happily he is safe. What is remarkable is last year, his mother, also a physician, an OBGYN, was also arrested, allegedly for providing care to opposition figures, although all her patients were women, and happily she's now out. But this shows the extent to which the idea that enemies do not deserve treatment and impartiality should be punished is prevalent. And that view has actually been incorporated into the law around the world, including the United States. That's a picture of Dr. Rafiq Sabir, an American physician who didn't provide care to terrorists, but just offered and told an FBI informant that he wished to be on call to treat wounded mujahideen in Saudi Arabia. He was convicted of material support for terrorism, and here's a little quotation from the Court of Appeals decision, say it's squarely within the prohibition. It's hard to imagine a law that stands as contrary to the principle of humanity and the letter of the Geneva Convention than this one. But this is common in the United States and around the world, and these countries have refused all entreaties to change these laws. In fact, I mentioned that Dr. Bayev got asylum in the United States. It's very unlikely that he would have gotten asylum now because he provided healthcare to a person who was deemed a terrorist. So how do we get back? How do we get back, at least my view that we need to get back to Dunantist norms? And of course, the law. This is existing law. No international treaties have as much support and reaffirmation as well as ratification as do the Geneva Conventions. But we've departed from them by allowing these rationales that are based on Francis Lieber's thinking to be incorporated into military practice. In the first place, I think there are sources of restraint. I identified three, and we have some wonderful examples I'll get to in a moment. One is there are many governments that purport to believe in the Geneva Conventions, but we need leadership at the political and military level, both not just to say we believe in them, not just tell soldiers obey the Geneva Conventions, but to address specific issues like how you enter a hospital, how you operate checkpoints, how you target. And that has to be incorporated into operations. Happily, there's some movement. Congress has gotten into the act here. It passed a law as part of the defense bill last December, saying that the Pentagon had to start doing these kinds of doctrinal and rule and training changes. A second thing that we need is domestic incentives, pressures, and accountability. Those too have been lacking. There haven't been accountability procedures. There haven't been incentives and political action to force policymakers and military leaders to adhere to the rules. And there's been another group missing, which is the public health and global health community. The first thing I said in this talk was how this was not on anybody's agenda. When you think about that quote about the Syrian doctors who were abandoned, what you realize is there's no solidarity compared with the solidarity with journalists. I think journalists should have solidarity. There should be full-page ads. There should be Nobel Peace Prizes. But the same should be true about the global and domestic medical communities, which has been largely silent about this issue with some minor exceptions. Finally, there has to be international action. We have mechanisms through the UN for human rights enforcement, pressures diplomatically, and we have an international criminal court, which could be used for this purpose. Well, why don't these things happen? One is the norms are not acknowledged. That is, the surreptitious, subterranean, Lieberesque norms are not acknowledged. Two, we have had a lack of domestic leadership and prevention, as I mentioned, and we have international paralysis on accountability. In part, that's a product of the structure of the UN Security Council, which allows a veto for any referral to the International Criminal Court for in any country that has not ratified it. So Russia has vetoed every attempt to refer Syrian cases to the International Criminal Court. In 2016, the UN Security Council did agree to a resolution for the first time in its history on the protection of healthcare in conflict. It did condemn the attacks. It called for reforms in military practice. It called for reforms in the law, such as the counterterrorism laws. It called for investigations. It called for accountability. And when domestic accountability fails, there must be international accountability. Basically, everything we wanted got into that 2016 resolution. It has had no effect. It has not been implemented. Even the governments who have been most outspoken against violence against healthcare and war have not taken steps to implement it. And that is truly astonishing. It shows the disconnect between diplomats who agree to these resolutions and the high-minded rhetoric and the operations in their military and political bodies. So we're not in a great place. We've made no progress since that resolution. On the other hand, as in so many areas of human rights, there are always sources of hope. On the left is a picture of Dr. Pierre Samse, the Minister of Health of the Central African Republic, and actually two of my students, Natalia Kasandova on the right and Sarah Wozniak on my left, when he went to Central African Republic just before the pandemic, he has actually put his life on the line in trying to stop violence. He's put pressure on armed groups. He calls them out. He demands that his government do more to control its forces, negotiates with peacekeepers, including telling peacekeepers when he thinks their intervention will make the situation worse. He works with humanitarian groups, and his leadership, all too rare, is a kind of a beacon of light that we hope can inspire others. And at the bottom, that's kind of a response to what I said a moment ago about the lack of medical engagement in this issue. This is the Turkish Medical Association protesting about the arrest of doctors and the laws that actually prohibit emergency medical care and political demonstrations without government approval. And they have put themselves on the line to the extent that some of them have been arrested. Most people in the profession won't be arrested and could speak out quite safely. But we have these wonderful models. And I want to conclude with this last quotation from Dunant. He refers to health workers as noble and compassionate spirits that of their own free will, they act for purpose of a motive of self-sacrifice. I think in this case, Dunant was wrong, that that's not what we should expect of people trying to provide healthcare in these fraught circumstances. We shouldn't demand self-sacrifice. Of course, we can celebrate their work, but we need to protect them, not just celebrate how wonderful they are for putting their lives on the line. So I'll stop there and just end with a plug. If you're interested in my book, there's a website, perillousmedicine.com, and I'm happy to now take questions.
Thank you very much, Len, for the really engaging presentation and obviously, in some respects, distressing. I would be just invite everybody again who would like to raise a question or make a comment to please do so. You can use the chat, the Q&A module, or you're welcome to raise your hand if you'd like to speak, and we can keep track of order. So with that, maybe I'll open with a couple of questions that we have here. So one in the Q&A is asking whether in healthcare settings where there's been an attack on healthcare workers or the hospital, whether there's any provisions in law that would support sort of safe passage for healthcare workers and civilians, patients and the like from that setting, or if the issues kind of transfer into that realm as well.
It's an interesting question because the law presumes that it will be obeyed, and that rather than saying how to escape or flight from a bomb facility, it says don't bomb the facility. It does have requirements of combatants not to locate hospitals in dangerous places to the extent possible. And for example, not to place landmines or other weapons near hospitals. But it's much more concerned with prevention than what you do in the event of an attack.
While we're waiting for more questions, maybe I'll just ask one myself. So do you see any trends or shifts over time in how clinics and hospitals are placed or protected? Have there been any changes in either how they're located or how they're the protections that are provided, let's say, to healthcare workers individually? Have there been movements in that direction?
There have been, and there are good examples. Actually, some basic, simple things. I mentioned Dr. Samse. He did work to try to provide more physical security building a fence around a hospital, simple things like that. There are operational procedures and there's training that can be done, health workers, how to respond. There's a whole variety of proposals, and the International Committee of the Red Cross has actually done tremendous work in making hundreds of recommendations how to improve security and deal with the possibilities of violence. So that's on the end. Of course, humanitarian organizations, and I talk about this a lot in the book, do an extraordinary amount of interaction, negotiation with combatants, whether armed groups or government forces to try to restrain them in some ways. And many of them are quite successful in setting ground rules, such as no weapons in health facilities, and making demands on these groups, even though they're the ones with the guns and they have the power. But an enormous amount of work has been put into this. I wrote the book because I wanted to look at the other end. That is, look at the perpetrators and the reasoning of the perpetrators. But yes, there's a tremendous amount of work on trying to improve protection at the ground level.
Great. So I see we have someone who'd like to speak. Anna, you're able to, I think, unmute if you'd like to raise your question. Looks like you're from ICRC, so be very interested to hear your comment.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you, Len. It's always a pleasure to hear you. I actually wanted to hear a little bit more from you, if you can talk about these the Lieberesque approach or the Lieberesque reading of military necessity when we're talking sometimes about conflicts that are extremely protracted. So we're talking sometimes about 10 years, 20 years, where IHL is ruling, where you have engaged military, where you have occupied territories, and then this idea of military necessity moves far, far beyond just the point of gaining quickly a territory or maybe displacing population, as we were talking about, you were talking about, and then we see a reality where there is ongoing hostilities, of course, but there's a whole setting up of a functional health system ongoing at the same time, like we saw, for example, in Afghanistan for years. So I would love to hear your thoughts on it and how Lieberesque view would or would not apply, and it fails or it does not fail to address this type of situation. Thank you.
It's a great question. It's nice that it came after I just complimented the ICRC on its work. The Afghanistan is a really interesting case. The Taliban have, because of their political objectives, have by and large, or not totally, but by and large, have not tried to blow up or burn down clinics. But they want to show that they can provide healthcare to the population. And they actually have a code that provides some restraints. And yet, and there are, of course, exceptions, as I noted. And yet, when in advance of their political objectives, they often use the same kind of logic. For example, they have coerced health clinics, many of them, to hire the people they want to hire. Patronage is a very big deal for them. And they want to control services, or they want to control gender issues in healthcare. And they're willing to use coercion and threats. And that coercion can include temporarily or kidnapping staff for a few days. And of course, the staff don't know how long they'll be taken. And it has to do with their political objectives as much as their military objectives. So I didn't get to talk about that, but that comes into play as well. there were more than 200 health facilities that were forced to close a couple of years ago, and the UN found that 3 million people were deprived of healthcare in that period. So we see this play out in many different ways. And in this overview, I couldn't go into all those different situations, but I think the idea of necessity has a much broader pattern of thinking, as you suggest.
Thank you, Anna, for your question. We have another question in the chat here from Travis, and I think reading his comment here, first congratulate you for a fantastic talk. And so Travis is commenting on the point that you made about, and I think there was an example of an individual who was a doctor who was tried for materially supporting terrorists. And I guess Travis's question is sort of, how do you square that with the healthcare that was provided to, for example, the Boston bomber? Are there differences here in the way in which it's being framed on the one hand and the other, and what are those differences, and were there repercussions for the Boston doctor?
That's a great question. Something else I didn't get to talk about, the counterterrorism laws as affects material support tend to be directed at people who are not in custody. So, for example, not only did doctors at Guantanamo not get prosecuted, first of all, they were military doctors, but the people were in custody. And certainly Tsarnaev was in custody as well. So they could be prosecuted, but as a matter of policy and, in their view, common sense, we don't prosecute doctors who are treating people who are in custody. And in some, I think that's the simplest answer to the question. There are circumstances, I think, where volunteer health professionals are more at risk also, but are not prosecuted. For example, anybody who goes to Gaza and provides volunteer care arguably could be subject to prosecution because the Ministry of Health and the whole government is controlled by Hamas, and arguably then too, they could be prosecuted. But those kinds of decisions have been left alone. The focus has been on these Islamic terrorist groups by and large, and they're focused mostly on people who are not in custody. So it's your question is a logical one, but I think there are practical reasons why it's not applied.
So we have another question here from Brian. And Brian, you're welcome to raise your hand if you want to ask it verbally, but I'll read it out for now. And if you want to follow up, please feel free. He asks, in the Rafik Sabir case, did the courts consider the applicability of the Geneva Conventions to the law issue? And more generally, are there any good strategies for getting U.S. courts to recognize international legal protections for healthcare workers?
The Geneva Conventions were not cited. There was an asylum case where years ago I cited a brief about a denial of an asylum to a Nepalese medic who had provided care. He was kidnapped actually by the armed groups in Nepal and forced to provide care, and then he escaped, but then the government of Nepal went after him, and we cited the Geneva Conventions, and the decision was they didn't apply. And although it wasn't explained why they didn't apply, the argument would be first that the United States is not a party to this conflict, that this is not, despite the war on terror, which is a global conflict, and the laws of war kind of manipulated sometimes to justify certain actions, they don't consider themselves a party to the conflict. On the other hand, you could say that human rights law bars these prosecutions, that the provisions are the same under human rights law, which does apply, and yet the courts don't refer to that. In adjudications in this country, domestic law always prevails over international law, unless it's specifically incorporated into domestic law. Even decisions on torture at Guantanamo were based on the enactment of domestic laws to implement the Geneva Conventions. So the whole problem of the role of of international law binding decisions made in the United States is very problematic.
Thanks, Len. I think we have time just for a couple more questions. So folks are welcome to drop them in the chat or raise hands. I'll ask while we're waiting, just if you wouldn't mind, maybe you could say a little more on the impact of attacks on healthcare facilities on sort of non-combat related care needs of the community. I think many of us assume that it's sort of, you know, an attack on this facility that's serving combatants and things like that, but it seems like it also significantly affect the population's health more generally. And I guess I assume there are studies. Have you done work and research to identify that kind of harm? Like to share.
I'd say first, that is the major harm.
Yeah.
That the most significant harm is against non-combatants, overwhelming civilians, because it's civilian hospitals that are being targeted, not military ones, especially in the civil wars, where all the care comes from civilian hospitals, that the armed groups don't have their own health facilities. And like in other areas, there's been very little work on this issue. There's a new consortium that I'm a part of, about 5 universities, that is doing work in a number of countries to try to better assess the impact of these attacks on population health. We're looking at things like measles and HIV and maternal mortality, and trying to tease out the distinction between general effects of war and the specific effects of the attacks. And that's methodologically challenging, and it's brand new as a field, and that's been a problem, that there hasn't been enough attention to this.
Yeah, great. I see there's some agreement with ratification of treaties being important in this space. Maybe one last question, if I could take the prerogative here. I would love to hear your thoughts on how bioethics and bioethicists can engage more with these issues. What do you think is, some pathways for those who are interested in these issues, but who are training in bioethics or otherwise, to engage, and what's needed for the future to move things forward in that regard?
Well, I think, as I try to convey, the bioethics issues here are significant. And no one has taken me on, though you could, about the difference between the Dunantist view and the Lieberesque view, and what that means in terms of bioethics principles and approaches. So there's a lot of fertile ground here. And I would welcome people just taking this on. Of course, the second obstacle, as we all know, is funding. That the whole, just one reason the public health and global health community don't do work on this is because there's no funding for it. And the same, I think, has been true in bioethics. But that should not be an obstacle. There's so much work to be done, and it could have such a huge impact that I would encourage everybody to do it.
Well, with that, maybe we'll close, and thank you for setting the stage for so much work that is yet to come and that is so needed. So thank you again, Len, for presenting today and for offering your book, and hopefully everyone will go out and purchase it. I'm sure it's a read that everyone needs to do. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe, and Jeff, and everyone.